The Home Fires Are Still Burning by Marie Chapman of Fennell Bay, 2283. Narrated by Janine Penfold. Life in the bush in the 1940s was a challenge. The family lived in a crude timber cottage on the perimeter of Flat Rock State Forest, South Coast, New South Wales. Both grandfather and dad were sleeper cutters for the New South Wales Railways. There were no modcons in Flat Rock. Nothing was simple. But Grandma always put food on the table, such as stew, mince, chicken. I remember chickens running in and out of the neighbour's house. Eggs were in abundance. Sometimes there was stewed fruits from the mill owner's garden. Other supplies were delivered by a relative from Milton on random occasions. Grandma managed with scarce tank water. Nothing to keep food cool except a dark pantry with a hanging meat safe. At night, she lit kerosene lamps. There was no electricity. I remember every room in the old cottage. In the centre was the room kept as a sitting room for visitors. However, when I came along, a little bed was placed under the window in that room so that I could see the moon and hear the boo-book owl. Dad slept in the sleep-out on the front veranda. My grandparents had a small bedroom facing the dirt road. My Auntie Doris, who had a disability, occupied a tiny room to the left of the kitchen. My grandma was overloaded with work and responsibility. No time for herself. On a high shelf in the kitchen, away from tiny fingers, was a brown Bakelite radio. At night, during the evening meal, we listened to Green Bottle, who burst onto the airwaves with a blast of, "Yes, what?" In the early mornings, the men rolled their cigarettes in front of the fire and listened to the BBC News. After breakfast, Grandma listened to Portia Faces Life and Blue Hills as she went about her daily routine. When the men came in from the mill at Smoko, the aroma of coffee and chicory hung in the air. Freshly baked scones and homegrown tomato jam were always plentiful. Sometimes there was whipped cream. How ever did Grandma do it without a refrigerator? Down the backyard was the rickety old dunny, covered with choco and passion fruit vines. It had a scary big hole and squares of newspaper swinging on a piece of wire. Green frogs would rest in there from time to time. Little feet froze going down there in winter. Bath time in winter was cosy. The tin tub was placed by the open fire. Grandma said that Pear's soap was the only soap for a child's body. My rubber Donald Duck went everywhere with me, even in the bath. It was a good life for a child, regardless of the scarcity of toys. Pie tins, empty boxes, clay and nature were my other playthings. Because the house was raised on piers, I was able to sit under there and use it as a cubby house. I never missed what I never had. Didn't know existed. In many ways, the family would have found life easier had we been closer to town, which would have been either Milton or Nowra, closer to medical facilities. I remember suffering with regular bouts of tonsillitis and earache, for which Grandma administered Friar's balsam as a gargle and warm oil for my ears. When Dad and Grandad were injured in the bush, Grandma did the fixing. It makes perfect sense now that Grandma owned a huge home medical book. I discovered this treasure in the bottom drawer of her wardrobe. Medical emergencies came and went. Mostly it was the men who were seriously injured in the mill or the bush who were transported by truck to town. At the time, there seemed to be plenty of timber work for the men. Like most, we were living the natural flow of what was life in the bush. But times seemed to change suddenly. Timber was replaced by cement railway sleepers. The mill closed. Most people moved away to find work. Dad and I moved to Stanmore, Sydney. Dad found work in a stainless steel sink factory at Milperra. I went to live with my maternal grandmother and started school at Stanmore Home Science. It was such a monumental change for everyone. I can only try to express the impact the early days had on my life. They were times when things were made up of simple pleasures and hard times. I'm still that kid from the bush. But life today gives me alternatives that Grandma didn't have. 4 decades later, I visited the flat rock I left and knew as a child. A familiar feeling of having come home overtook me. My husband stayed in the car while I wandered. I had no real desire to leave. Ever. Even though there were no remnants of what used to be. If you hadn't lived there, the emptiness of the place now would speak of nothing significant. Today, there is a modern building on the land where our house stood. It's not surprising that someone would want to build a beautiful house out there. If I'm honest, I feel a little territorial. Recalling the visit helps to recreate a connection to a significant past. I now consider the many things I learned from Grandma. She taught me how to be resourceful, instilled in me a sense of contentment and being able to make do with what I have. But her greatest gift has been the example of how to manage hardship and isolation, and to still find time for family who are also doing it tough. But the modern woman seeks to find time for herself, something Grandma didn't have the luxury of. The BBC News preamble and music, Pears soap, the moon, the sometimes call of the boobook owl, or a vase full of wild freesias are my flat rock indulgences. Through them, the home fires are still burning. The end.